There he is.
Hey, Adrian. Good to see you.
Good to see you. What's going on, man?
Staying busy, researching, writing, I guess. How about you?
Yeah, no writing
Okay.
and researching and stuff like that, but I'm podcasting, working, got a new business that's really kicking off, so I'm really happy about that. And yeah, just loving having conversations with interesting people like you.
Awesome. Well, congrats on that new business. It's exciting.
Thank you, buddy. I am about I'd say two-thirds of the way through the end upside down medicine. Um, I'm glad you popped it up on Spotify. Um,
Yeah, you're the second person to tell me that. I didn't realize it's on Spotify for free,
oh,
which
you
is
didn't
great.
know?
I didn't know. I love it. That's great news. Get it to
Yeah,
more people.
it's funny because I got off Audible a couple of years ago, and I started getting into just physical books, and I thought, you know what, I've got a stack of books. There's a few things that I want to reread, and I do like the physical aspect of touching a book and sitting down at a cafe and kind of reading and just being with alone with my thoughts and things like that. So I started getting into that. However, I've only just recently discovered that on Spotify you can get audiobooks on the premium service, I guess, right? And yours come up, and it was only just recently just popped in because I've searched for it before. So it's been great. I've been at work and I've been doing my, going for walks and stuff like that, and I've got you in my ear,
Oh man,
going on
it's a
with
lot of my
you.
voice.
Yeah, that's right. So it's really, really good. So congrats to you, man. And
Thank you.
I think the last time that we spoke, when we were talking about like your series of books, I alluded to the fact that do you think like you'd sort of go down the flat Earth path, and you sort of said anything's open, to like to as a possibility, and you probably were finishing that book as I was as I said that, I suppose.
No, because that actually, do you want to wait until we officially start for me to tell the story?
No, we've started.
We've started already.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's right. No,
Okay.
we're good to go, man. You can
Okay.
talk to whatever you
Okay.
like.
Yeah. So I don't remember when we recorded the last interview, but
Yeah, good question.
I think it was after that interview that I started looking into it seriously. I'd heard a lot of people talk about it, and I was interested because a lot of people that I respect were saying like, "Hey, Mark, there's something here," and a
Mm,
lot of people that, especially people that came to what I thought were very rational conclusions regarding allopathic medicine and germ theory,
yep.
they were saying, look, if you apply the logical approach that we do to medicine to cosmology, you see that the mainstream cosmology is just full of errors. So it wasn't until April of 2024 that I really started looking into it. It was when Steve Young's book came out. It's called A Fool's Wisdom. He has
Mm,
a PhD in theoretical physics,
no way.
and uh, and he wrote in his book. The whole book is not just about cosmology, but he has a few chapters on it. And he goes, "Look, I'm not 100% certain what this place is, but I'm 100% certain it's not a spinning globe." And he went through a bunch of physics in layman's terms and just a lot of I think, plain language reasoning that was helpful for me to just get up to speed. Like, what are the main arguments people are making?
Yep.
And that was a big deal for me, for anyone with that level of education, to say, I've looked at this for years. I actually tried to disprove it. That's what he said, because so many people would talk about flat Earth. He said, this is crazy. And he wasn't able to disprove, he wasn't able to prove the spinning globe model. Let's just say that
Mm.
there were just many problems with it, and um, observations that seemed to just not line up with the current cosmology. So that was early April 2024. And then right after reading that book, I went to a conference in Texas called Confluence. Alex Zeck runs it, and The Way Forward, and a bunch of his colleagues. And a lot of people there were talking about cosmology and shape of the Earth. And I had this conversation with a few friends, including Yerasimos, who hosts Here for the Truth podcast, and
Yeah.
Melly Newbeck's another friend of mine. And they hadn't looked into the topic much, just sort of like I hadn't. And they were saying, look, everyone's talking about this cosmology stuff. Why does it really matter? Like, even if it isn't a spinning globe, does that affect my life? I still have to go to work every day. So I was getting these nudges. And maybe you were one of the first ones to do it in a public way, or like, just, you were not the first person, actually. A bunch of people were
Yep.
saying, hey, Mark, look at this. So after Confluence, I started looking into it much more deeply, ordered every book I could, And then I did my normal process where I saw the holes in the paradigm. And long story short, there's a new book, An End to the Upside Down Cosmos. So the sixth book, the one you referenced before, An End to Upside Down Medicine, that was published in end of 2023. And then this Cosmology book just came out, and it's been kind of a mad rush the
Yeah,
last few
well,
months. And that's why I didn't have much else to update you on.
yeah, no, that's all right. I, have you done anything on religion?
Religion comes up in a lot of the books, but I would say it comes up most in the book An End to Upside Down Contact,
Consciousness.
which is
Yeah.
about
Oh,
contact
contact. Yeah.
with
Okay.
non-human intelligence, because inevitably you end up looking at ancient texts and scripture. But I didn't do a massive review of it. And it's something I've wanted to look at, like I guess comparative religion is something you might call it, like looking
Yeah.
deeply at all the religions around the world. But it's a very tough exercise because in order to understand a lot of them, you need to know the native language often to understand the nuance of what they're actually saying in the text. And then are the texts translated faithfully? Like, I have a lot of questions with it, but I think it's an important topic.
Yeah. I think it'd be interesting for someone like you to go down that path, particularly when you talk to, say, the origin story, and you touch on that briefly in Upside Down Medicine. Like I know you bring in consciousness because there's I mean, you mentioned like Alex Zeck, and you mentioned the Baileys. Like I've interviewed Sam Bailey before, and she sort of alluded way back in like 2021, 22, I think it was, that the no virus theory and all that kind of stuff. So when you talk into consciousness and you talk into, we can affect each other's um, illnesses, I guess, and ourselves by the way that we think, feel, and act, and everything's kind of like this one thought, universal consciousness type of theory. Then it does circle back in some ways and loop into the origin of man. And so that to me is like it's a fascinating topic. But when yeah, have you ever thought about have your books touching on that, or have you ever thought about maybe pulling something together along those lines? Like, where do we come from? That's a age old question.
Yeah, it's a great question. I guess all the books touch on it in some way because they're trying to understand what's the nature of reality, what's the structure of society, and inevitably you end up with the same questions like how did this all start?
Mm.
And then the next question is what's our real history? Because even just looking at the mainstream media, we see that so many things that can be shown as psyops are part of the mainstream narrative. And those are things that we can track in real time. But imagine what happened a long time ago when there wasn't the technology we have today. So what's in the history books that is not true? Um, it's a really deep question, and I don't know. Like I'm not at a point where I have a firm answer on it, but where I'm going more and more with this is that we are living within layers of ignorance, and I don't think it's innocent ignorance. Because I used to think when I first started this stuff, oh, it's possible that we could miss, let's just say, the question of consciousness, because there are many scientists who have big egos and they don't want to admit that they're wrong. So we end up just stuck in a paradigm, and then there's not a lot of funding. Whereas now I think there's some of that ignorance too, like innocent ignorance, but then there's an imposed ignorance where there are some people or energies or metaphysical forces that are keeping us from knowing the truth about who we are, um, why we're here, and then as I talk about in the most recent book, An End to the Upside Down Cosmos, where we are. Because I'd been asking in my first, let's say, several books, like who am I? Like what does it mean to be a human being, and why are we all here? But I didn't ask what here means. I didn't ask where are we. I never really, because I that mainstream cosmology was so stuck in my mind of like there's a big bang, and maybe there were problems with the evolution theory of Darwin's evolution, but still we're in this vacuum of space flying around and rotating, and revolving around the sun, and gravity works a certain way, and Einstein's relativity works a certain way, and we're on a spherically shaped planet. I wasn't questioning any of that. I thought that was pretty solid.
Mhm.
So that's the latest rabbit hole I've gone down in this new book. And it then makes me ask those other questions you're getting at of like, okay, what if this place is not what we've been told? What does that mean about our origin story and our true history? How did this all start? Why did it all start? And why is it that we seem to be so far from knowing the truth about what that is? I mean, some people might claim they know the truth, but let's just say the mainstream narrative of science and history, there are many holes that we can point in it. And
Mm.
why is that narrative so far off?
Yeah, that's so true. And I think, do you ever get stuck into the kind of echo chamber of this is the paradigm of the world that I'm looking through at the moment, and then you start to gravitate towards, like, I listen to Here for the Truth podcast, and I like listening to different conversations along the same interest that I have. When I interview people like yourself, I'm interested in you. I'm interested in your work and the way you think. So, I only interview people that I have a personal gravitation towards. But do you find that you get stuck in this echo chamber of uh, leaning towards maybe one type of thinking, but because it does come from this sort of foundational premise of what else isn't true, and then you're kind of looking for evidence to support that, how do you then, I guess my question is, do you then become distrustful? Do you then become like very, highly skeptic to everything else that's going on? It's like, like what else isn't true? And then my whole life's been a lie. And then it's kind of like evolved into this, well, why the hell am I here? And what am I supposed to do if all that I am doing is working against the force that is trying to put me into a particular box or narrative that I, once thought was true, and now I'm, my whole world, to use your books, like, has been turned upside down, right?
Yeah, it's a great point. I've had some people close to me ask that question. It's like, so Mark, you're just saying everything's wrong about the world. And that's actually not the way. I mean, I actually kind of do think that the more I look into things. But basically now, if something is presented to me as a truth, I don't just accept it. I say, if this is accepted as such a sure truth, surely there should be bulletproof evidence to back it up.
Mm-hmm.
So I look for it now. And I haven't had time to do it with everything. I'm doing it as fast as I can. And there are many paradigms I haven't explored yet, but like germ theory or spinning globe or consciousness coming from the brain, all these things, we end up with often a logical fallacy,
Yeah.
many logical fallacies, but the one in particular that I've been talking about a lot recently, it's called affirming the consequent.
Mm-hmm.
And the technical way of describing it is, if X, then Y is true, therefore X. So an example, if it rains, then the grass outside will be wet. The grass outside is wet, therefore it rained. The second statement could be true, but to say that rain is the only reason why the grass is wet, big problem, because there are many other reasons grass could be wet.
Yeah.
There could have been a sprinkler system. There could have been dew on the grass. Children could have walked by and poured buckets of water on the grass. We could create millions of reasons. And what seems to happen is that many mainstream narratives are stuck into one model of causality, one model to explain why things are happening. And then other explanations have been shut out. So anything that's new that's observed, they just force fit it into the one model, into it rained.
Mm.
So that's what I'm seeing all over the place. So if someone says to me, well, I have this one proof, I can show you why it's true. And you can say, well, yeah, your model certainly accommodates that observation. Like if the grass is wet, it might have rained, but you're ignoring all the other possibilities. And that's what I'm seeing everywhere. It's like people are taking as a truth just one model and they've ignored everything else. And
Sure.
that's basically the mechanism by which we can be led into ignorance. Because
Mm.
there's a hint of potential truth there, that it's conceivable that you could build the whole model on it rained last night and that's why the grass is wet, and every other observation we can force fit into that model that it rained, and then we ignore all the other stuff. There's no funding toward it. If you ask whether or not it rained, even ask the question, you're a conspiracy theorist. We could apply this to political thinking, economic thinking, scientific thinking. And so I think about it more just from the perspective of logic rather than just wanting to be a naysayer. It's like, and I think your point about the echo chamber is really important, because it could be compelling just to say, like, these are my people, and if they think something is true, then I must believe it also.
Yeah.
That has not been my approach. I mean, it's certainly compelling if there are people I respect who have looked at something and they're going out on a limb publicly for something that's unpopular. I'm like, okay, something's up, because this is not a stupid person. And when there are many of them, then I get interested. But that's not enough for me to then like write a book or talk publicly. I have to build it up myself, see what the mainstream paradigm is. And if I can't prove the mainstream paradigm to myself, or find scientists that can prove it, or even find any like mainstream evidence that to prove the narrative, then we've got a big problem. And that's this, it's happening over and over again. Like with cosmology, it's not just that there's one little hole, there's holes everywhere.
Hmm.
And it's all over physics. Same thing with consciousness, same thing with medicine, and many other places. So I think that it's all for me about questioning assumptions. If I'm assuming something is true, I now ask myself, well, what is the basis for that assumption? And have I challenged those things that I think are true within the assumption? And then when I look deeply, often I find that there are stretches that might not always be as solid as I thought.
Yeah, for sure. Is it hard to verify those hunches, or whatever you're trying to prove or disprove, or at least question the validity of a particular piece of text, or whatever it may be? Is it hard to do that nowadays because the internet's so curated to, I guess, steer you in the direction of where it wants you to go? Like, even when I've seen your post where you use ChatGPT to ask about flat Earth and things like that, and you have to almost be manipulative to a degree to make sure that it gives you a particular answer. Otherwise, it'll just go, "This is a disproven theory," and it's all nonsense. And people, some say it is, but there's nothing that can verify to be true. But it's the internet is just so curated to, even when you're looking for something specific, it'll take you in a direction that leads you to what it wants you to know. It's a very scary thing.
Yes, for sure. And I think the search engines, whether it's through AI or just using Google search, there are prioritized answers. That's what I find. And they push us toward the mainstream narrative.
Mm.
But there are certain counter narratives that are also strong where you can find a lot of evidence. So let's say my first book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, challenging the idea that the brain produces consciousness and instead suggesting, look, there's a lot of evidence that consciousness exists outside the brain and the body. The human being is some kind of a vessel. Psychic phenomena are real. We all have them to some subtle degree. Our body can die when our consciousness can continue afterwards. Reincarnation might be real, all these things. There's so much research on that. So even though I was challenging a narrative, I had this massive body of evidence from a lot of credible people to draw from, to say, look, I feel good to write this book. And I was still working at my job in Silicon Valley when I wrote that. But what I found is that as I've gone deeper, there are some credible people challenging the narratives, but it's a much smaller space. So it does make me nervous. I'm like, did I miss something here? Like, what's going on? There aren't as many people talking about this. Could it be that so many people are just missing this big paradigm shift? And it's like a narrower and narrower space that I seem to be falling into, which does create nerves. And I have to, I guess, just feel a lot of conviction with the approach that I'm using. Like, I mean, we just had a world shutdown based on an alleged virus, SARS-CoV-2.
Mm-hmm.
And to contend that that doesn't even exist, or just it has not been isolated, meaning there's no purified sample of just the virus, because no scientific study has been conducted on it, meaning in order to have a scientific study, you need a truly independent variable. And if you have an independent variable, then you can have a proper control. But if there's no independent variable, you can't have a proper control. Therefore, you're conducting pseudoscience. To make that kind of argument for something that caused a global shutdown, like that, it's hard to do that. Same thing with the cosmology. It's like you're going to go against all these agencies that are and these astrophysicists that are claiming this stuff, and there aren't that many people with, let's say, physics degrees. Like Steve Young is one example of who counters it, but many people who might have these alternative beliefs as PhDs, they're not talking about it publicly. So
Yeah.
it's a challenge for all of us in that regard.
Yeah, 100%. When you think about like the virus theory and particularly like the shutdown, what you mentioned before about the echo chamber, you're looking towards or gravitating towards people who think like you, and then you get this confirmation bias to go, well, if they think that same way, then maybe I'm onto something. I think the credibility for me, like when I started to speak out about the narrative and COVID and things like that, I had a business that was an indoor business. It was a recreation industry. It's an indoor skate park. And so it was getting shut down. I only just opened it. So it was like poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into this thing. And then 6 weeks later, it got shut down. And the more I spoke about it, the more the crazier I sounded. And then I had to kind of take a step back and go, look, I need to actually seek people who are thinking along the same way, or at least giving me evidence to support that maybe I'm not as nuts as what people are saying. And that was the life raft that I needed in order to connect with others around and spawn this podcast, to kind of go, this is who I need to talk to in order to feel like I was sane. So I would talk to someone like yourself, or the Peter McCullers and the Pierre Coreys of the world, and the Dr. Sam Baileys and all that kind of stuff, and I'd be like, if these people, they can't be that unintelligent, they can't be that silly to think that perhaps they're what the world is saying collectively is not what it's saying. So they fly in the face of a huge machine that is pushing one particular narrative. But to me, it supported that perhaps I wasn't as crazy as what I thought. And then also it gave me, I guess, comfort and solace in the fact that maybe I can direct my life in a way that is conducive to a solution to this problem, rather than living a life in a constant state of fear and worry and angst about something looming around the corner. Does that make sense to you?
Totally. I felt very alone as well, especially starting in 2020, because most people around me were buying the narrative completely. And what's happened in the last several years, I think, is that those of us who question the narrative, and it's a growing group, but we've
Yeah.
sort of found each other even all over the world, even though we might not be physically near each other. There's
Yeah.
a similar way of thinking. I was actually just in the Netherlands. I have a Dutch publisher who translated my Medicine and Liberty books into Dutch and
Mhm.
had me come over to do some interviews and give a lecture there. And it's just amazing to go there and see the same kind of thinking, even though it's a different language, different culture. It's the same thought process, and people feeling isolated in some ways, but then they find their community. So that's, I guess, the blessing and the challenge, because we've all faced challenges over the last several years. But the blessing, I think, is part of the awakening to all of the falsehoods, to the many falsehoods in the world, and breaking through the ignorance that many of us naively had. And without the last few years, maybe we would have never broken through this way, or at least not
Yeah.
so quickly.
Yeah, for sure. Look, the spin of it is like, the positive is that through this sort of mass control and this sort of huge push, I think that whoever wants to control the world and its people and all the rest of it is they sort of played their cards like too hard. They pushed it too fast, and they just got wilder and wilder. Like the things that have been touted at the moment are just beyond comprehension as to how people can be thinking that this is actually logical or even makes sense. But it caused a huge wave of people that to start thinking a little bit more critically about the things that they do say and feel. Just to question their own existence is a profound kind of thought process. But to the degree that they now go through life thinking strategically, or at least consciously, about like how they live their lives, is it's been a blessing. I think it's a powerful thing. There's two ends of the spectrum though. Like you can take it too far. Like I've got people that look at all the possibilities of what could be at play, and I think you get to the point where you could be so paranoid about the world just going to shit that you don't live. You're paralyzed by fear and by anxiety that maybe the world's just going to capitulate and there's nothing we can do about it.
Yeah, that is the danger of being overly black-pilled. It's like a fine line of knowing that there's deception and evil in the world, and but not being consumed by it. And
Yeah.
probably many of us, maybe yourself included, maybe many members of your audience. I know I was there. There's certain things I learned about where it brought me into a very dark place. Like, well, what is there any hope here? I don't feel that way now. I'm more desensitized to the dark stuff. I know that it exists, and I just kind of accept that and navigate around it. That's how I look at it. And I feel actually hopeful because there's so much truth coming to light. And to me, that's a signifier that we live in some kind of a reality where we're not fully enslaved. Because I
Mm.
think if we were fully enslaved, we wouldn't have these glimmers of light. And the fact that we do have the glimmers of light is that's to me a very positive thing. And the fact that it's accelerating at this rate. So it's like, I think there's stages to this awakening process of like the ups and the downs, but I think it's a net upward trajectory for those who want to go down the path. But kind of like you were saying, Adrian, I know a lot of people who on paper are incredibly brilliant, who fully buy the narrative and will
Mm.
say things that are to me just outrageous for anyone who's spent 5 minutes looking outside of the mainstream media and believe it completely, and will think that anyone who is not believing what they think is a crazy conspiracy theorist who's lost his or her mind. So
Yeah.
we're not fully there yet. And maybe that's how it's going to be, that some members of society are going to keep going with the narrative and others aren't. But I do feel like it's shifting.
Yeah, for sure. The thing that gives me comfort, Mark, is that if you look at history and any kind of ancient text, it depicts worlds that are quite chaotic, but it also depicts worlds that are beautiful and blissful, and there is harmony and there's ascension in terms of consciousness and a higher state of being and a way of living. And so that to me, there's always this sort of like, in my mind, cycles of time there. And I feel like, I don't know, do you ever play sport, or have you ever hurt yourself where you've got, a sprained ankle, or you've got a huge bruise or a cut? It's like at the beginning when you do it, it's the most painful, and then it starts the healing process. So it kind of
Mm.
takes a week or two or three or whatever to kind of get to the point where the scab forms, and then it starts to fall off and you got new skin underneath. But the initial part of where it's hemorrhaged or cut or whatever it is the most painful. And I feel like we're at that kind of like hemorrhaging point now. And that's why it might feel like it is super painful and hard to hear and hard to tolerate. And you feel like maybe there isn't much hope, but it kind of has to rise to the surface. It's almost like I don't know, like a pimple. It needs to sort of, get the pus towards the top, and then you pop it, and then all of a sudden, it's got a chance to heal. And I feel like we're at that stage right now. It may be another few years away, but I think we're right there. Do you agree?
Yeah, I'm feeling that way too. And really, a lot of the darkness that many people are speaking about now has probably always been there. And like you say, it's now coming to the surface. So we might just be shocked at first to say, oh my goodness, things are so bad right now. Actually, they probably have always been this way. And there's just been immense ignorance since who knows when, depending on what the actual origin story of this place is. But it's just like it's now coming to the surface.
Mm.
And that's part of the healing process. I mean, there seems to be a process all throughout life, whether it's healing or another sports analogy. So I was a competitive tennis player. I played Division I tennis in college. And when I trained really hard, it was super painful, but then I'd be much better when I played in matches, and I'd be much more nuanced in my strategy. I'd just be really on point. But if I didn't go through that pain, I wouldn't have been as good in the end. So I do think there is something to suffering that has an evolutionary element to it, even though it can be really hard for us to see. And I'm saying this to myself because I often find the painful periods really tough, whether it's just in a macro level or personal level. It can be tough. It's like, why am I going through this? It's horrible.
Yeah.
But it always does steer us in a direction of growth in some way. I haven't seen an example where that's not true yet. No matter how painful, there's something that is gained in terms of knowledge or discernment or something that is ultimately steering us in a growth path.
Hmm. Yeah, I like it. When I was doing a talk the other day, and I was talking to um, the fact that our thoughts can make us feel great, and our thoughts can also make us feel sick. When if we talk to the virus, where you feel like you may have an itch in your throat, and then in the past you may have thought, and even people listening might think the same thing. I've got this itch in my throat, and they go, "Man, I'm coming down with something." And then they think, well, if I'm coming down with something, then if it gets itchy, it's probably going to go through, like, it's going to be a chest infection. And then I'm going to have, like, probably have to take 3 days off work. And, what about the kids, and what about all these things? And all of a sudden, everything that they thought manifested, and they created it in their lives. As opposed to having the thought process of, my body's a self-healing machine and it's just going to fix itself. And the fact that it's causing mucus or snot or whatever it is, to come out of my body, is the fact that my evidence to support that my immune system is actually working, and I'm just going to heal as fast as humanly possible. So I'm curious to know when, like, particularly because I'm invested in the ends upside down medicine, when you talk about the no virus theory, coming from the point of view of maybe in the past where you thought viruses are real, everything exists, and this is what's going on, and from a medical perspective, how do you now, like, think or live, or how do you modify or have you modified your life to that new level of thinking? Is it hard for you still to compute, or do you find yourself catching yourself out thinking with through the old paradigm of the world, or do you move and think differently now?
I definitely move and think differently. It was not overnight, but writing these books really helps me, especially with medicine, because I'm forced to write down every citation. The books have hundreds of citations. So before it goes in the book, I've vetted things a lot and therefore it sticks. And then I probably embody it a bit more just because I have to go through that process of checking and revising and researching.
Mhm.
So as I was writing that book, I realized, whoa, actually, this notion of a virus, which is a very specific thing, by the way. It's a form of a intracellular parasite, replication competent intracellular parasite that gets inside of a host cell and causes disease. It's not just like the ancient definition of a virus was some kind of poison, but since 1953, which was the Watson and Crick double helix structure of DNA paper, that in many believe created the impetus for this notion of a genetic uh, particle that can get inside our cells. And then when writing the book, I realized that that has not been established using the scientific method, in spite of any pictures that we might see, which are never of a purified sample. So we do see pictures, but that doesn't mean that the picture we're seeing is of a virus. And we, especially pictures that are from electron microscopes, those are showing static images of something that's dead, whereas a virus is supposed to be moving around and living. So we don't actually see the virus doing all the things that it's supposed to be doing, which is getting inside the host cell and causing a disease. We end up creating these movies, these animations in our mind, which again, affirming the consequent logical fallacy, we create models. But in any event, once that sort of thinking became embedded, and then also reading things like Christine Massey's work, who's submitted freedom of information requests all over the world to the CDC and many other health organizations. And they're saying over and over again, no, we don't have a purified sample of this virus, whether it's SARS-CoV-2 or other ones. And they say, actually, what you're asking us to do is not violates the gold standard, because the gold standard that they use does not actually create a purified sample. So it's a pretty crazy thing.
Mhm.
So I think what you're asking is, well, how's that informed, like how you think about health and disease? Um, I still don't know exactly what the full determinants are, because once you start to get metaphysical, I mean, how could a past life affect our health? For example, the work of Dr. Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia and Jim Tucker, where they find children who have past life memories, over 2,500 cases. And some of the kids actually have birthmarks or physical defects that align with how they claim to have died in a previous life. And there are
Wow.
medical records that validate what the kids said. So Dr. Stevenson, this is medical doctor, University of Virginia. He's like, I mainstream medicine will tell you there are two factors that affect your health: genetics and environment. And here we have something that's neither genetics nor environment. So there's a third factor affecting our health. So there's a metaphysical context that I think I'm still trying to understand, and an energetic one. But beyond that, I like the way you're describing it, where like you're reminding me of an approach called German New Medicine,
Hmm.
which was basically conceived by Dr. Hammer in the late 1970s and 80s, where he found that by looking at brain scans, there are lesions in the brain that correspond to a sort of emotional shock, a conflict that then corresponds to an organ. And after looking at many, many brain scans and knowing the history of the patients, you can, if someone comes to a German new medicine practitioner with symptoms, you can quickly say, okay, this is the conflict that you're working through. Now, depending on the conflict and the symptoms that you have or the condition you're dealing with, the symptoms that you're experiencing can be part of the resolution, meaning you've actually resolved the conflict and your body is flushing out whatever whatever had to build up in order to handle that conflict. So the symptoms are part of your resolution. And then when the symptoms go away, it's that your body's flushed out all the excess stuff. I'm just paraphrasing. So it
Sure.
is a new way of contextualizing illness. Another way to look at illness, and this ties in with German New Medicine also, is that you're being steered to look at something in your life that maybe needs to shift. And maybe that's dietary, maybe it's emotional, whatever it is. So it's a new context versus the mainstream allopathic approach, which is you don't feel well. Okay, here's a Band-Aid. We put the Band-Aid on, we're good. We're not going to think it's about the root cause of why you had it or whether it's going to come back. We'll keep putting the Band-Aid on just to keep the symptom
Mm.
gone. And certainly we're not going to think about spiritual causes. That's not part of the allopathic approach either. So in the book and Upside Down Medicine, I'm really trying to bring all this other stuff to light.
Yeah. The thing about allopathic medicine as well is like there's the sentiment that you don't know what's lurking in your body until you get a test to find out what's going on. right? So my dad falls into this trap all the time, and we have interesting conversations. He's like, when's the last time you had a colonoscopy done, or when's the last time you had this sort of blood work done, or whatever. And like, you just don't know what's lurking around, and that may be true to a certain degree, but my belief is that there will be signs. There are things that will be indications that perhaps your health is not optimal. One of the things that I've spoken to in the last couple of years is I just don't think we know how great we can actually feel once we start living a life that is conducive to really good health. And what you're talking to is, it's not just your physical health, it's your spiritual and mental health, it's all of these things. So to talk to the fact that perhaps there's a past life, or perhaps there's a particular ailment that something is going on in my body that's relating to an organ. And you look at, say, like you mentioned, the German medicine, but you look at Chinese medicine, you look at acupuncture, you look at all of those sorts of practices and modalities that look to certain parts of the body for pressure points and all those sorts of things which stimulate organs in the body. It's the awareness, or that consciousness, that's been stripped of our knowledge and over the years is taking us away from our body. Does that make sense? Like you're not in tune with yourself anymore. You're looking externally for validation, or for the conclusion as to why you might be the way that you are, without actually looking internal. You with me so far?
Yeah, and also this notion of an invisible enemy, that you
Oh,
can't see it and it's going to come get you, and there's really nothing you can do other than trust the authorities for a solution to it. It's all about, in the mainstream approach, like offloading your autonomy and not trusting yourself, but having someone else tell you what you should be doing because they know what's best for you. And
yeah,
we see this politically and otherwise. It's kind of a similar theme. You have to trust the expert class because they always know what's best for you, versus what you're describing of like getting really in tune with our own body, mind, spirit, and becoming our own doctors in a way. I know
mm,
many people wouldn't like from the mainstream wouldn't like to hear that, because it's like, well, who are you to be able to treat yourself? But that's probably more of an ancient approach, where certainly there are healers who can help you, but the individual seems to be the ultimate healer. That's one of the conclusions I come to when I see just so many healings using alternative modalities. It's like there can be a healer that helps you heal yourself, but ultimately you end up doing the work.
yeah, I like that. There's it's interesting you mentioned politics. Like there's that uh, that field is. I mean, obviously you got an election coming up in a couple of days. Um, there's there's a few things I wouldn't mind getting your viewpoints on, because again, like, this world is kind of skewed towards sort of one team or the other team, and so it seems to be like two sides of the same coin. When we talk about individual sovereignty or self-governing individuals, being your own doctor, like it's almost, there's a distrust from the mainstream narrative or the governmental control. It's like, you can't trust yourself, so we're going to do that for you, and we're going to give you a set of rules and guidelines. But I think it can get little bit loose. Some people can maybe take that to an extreme, but I think for the main part, society finds an equilibrium and eventually comes to a consensus that we are on the right or wrong path. I think from a moral perspective, like, we know deep down what's right and what's wrong. But from a political standpoint, like, how are things in the States at the moment, and what's your sort of view on like how things are being directed politically? Because it seems like this sort of truth freedom movement is interwoven now into one party and not the other. So it seems to be, I don't know, pulling on the heartstrings of people like you and I that may be more conducive to, well, not so conducive, but you would be leaning towards thinking that this person's going to make life better for us. I'm not sure if I'm being as clear
Yeah,
as I possibly am. Wondering a little bit.
yeah, good questions. I actually haven't talked about any of this stuff publicly, so this might be the only time
Yeah.
because we're right before the election. I'll do it here. I've
Go
been
for
so
it.
focused on the cosmology book, and for some reason haven't felt as drawn to even like care in a way. Whereas 4 years
Right.
ago, I seem to care a lot more. It's strange because maybe when I've learned about these other bigger deceptions, like where we live or what makes us sick or whether germs cause disease, like those sorts of big questions where I think there are big errors, it's sort of like, okay, well, these political, I don't know, these political decisions are, they're missing the bigger point. But in any event, I've written two books that are pretty political. One is called An End to Upside Down Liberty, and another one's called An End to the Upside Down Reset. And
Mhm.
the point I make, especially in the Liberty book, is it's against the state altogether. It argues for voluntarism, where basically everything that the state, meaning government, provides could be provided by a company, basically a service provider. Like why does government have special privileges? They're just a bunch of human beings. Why should this group of people be trusted to do things outside of a free market where they're going to get paid no matter what through taxation? There's a lot of logical fallacies also in the mainstream view of politics that we need this group of people, even though they're human beings. And most of the time, the whole reason we say we need government is because we don't trust people. And then we take people, which is a subset of the population of people we didn't trust, and then put them in power. So I have a problem in general with the logic of having government at all, or having rulers,
Yep.
which makes it hard for me to get very behind anything with enthusiasm. Whereas 4 years ago, it was a little bit different because I hadn't looked into that as much. Um, but I will say this, I like my book on the Great Reset, An End to the Upside Down Reset. I was very critical of the left in that book, especially leftism. And I talk about it as a metaphysical socio-political philosophy. It's a very deep way of thinking. And it's often characterized by a deep sense of wanting to seem compassionate, but then being blinded by compassion and then supporting things that are actually harmful, but seem compassionate on the surface. And
Mhm.
then all kinds of hypocrisy emerges. So my knee-jerk reaction always is to be hypersensitized against the left, meaning that I think even though I don't like the state and I think the state is a problem, we live under the paradigm of statism, whether we like it or not, all around the world. We have different types of states. Some are freer than others, but they're all still a form of tyranny, ultimately. That's the way I see it. Even quote unquote democracy, that is the majority getting to tell other people what to do. I mean, think about it. You could vote for someone, lose, and then someone else gets to tell you what to do. Is that really, that's a form of tyranny? Like that's not benign. So I am more sensitized to the left, and I do think the left tends to control the mainstream narrative. And I think there's relatively more hypocrisy in the left. There's hypocrisy on both sides. And I also just don't really trust that the system is going to be fair in terms of um, how the results are collected. I mean,
Yeah.
we don't have access to how every vote is counted. So how can we really know what's happening and whether someone's just being put into a position, whoever the powers that be are, for whatever reason? So I really don't know what's going to happen. That's my way of saying I don't know because we don't know
Yeah.
how the things are counted. Like, how can we really trust the results? And um, I think the state is problematic no matter what. I do think the left, especially in America, is relatively more tyrannical than the right would be, even though I have a lot of, I don't agree with everything on the right. I do think that there's relatively more freedom coming from the message on the right. So we will
Mm.
see what happens. But from a bigger perspective, I think a lot's been exposed in the last 4 years under the Biden administration. That's probably woken people up.
Yeah.
So it's just like what happened with starting in 2020. You could have something that maybe makes people upset, but in the end, it can awaken.
Mm.
And for that reason, I'm not feeling super attached either way, but it's interesting and also pretty frustrating to see a lot of the hypocrisy and a lot of the way the media is concealing information or even making things up or taking things out of context. It's pretty wild to see it. And it's actually, um, we have a freer Twitter than we did in 2020. I know some
Mhm.
people will argue that there is some shadow banning. I don't know, but I know in 2020 there was clear censorship of the Hunter Biden laptop and other
100%.
things. And now a lot of the stuff is being exposed, the hypocrisy. So I think this is a big awakening where you have
Mhm.
bigger names out there calling out the hypocrisy, like Bill Ackman, who's more traditionally liberal, calling this stuff out. So I think it's all probably part of our collective evolution.
Yeah.
And I'll just pause there, see what you have to say.
No, I like the way you think. I personally hope, I'm not sure if you know that recently in the last week or so, Candace Owens has been denied access to Australia because she might invoke discord or some shit like that. It was worded that way. So, and I interviewed David Icke a couple of months ago. He hasn't been let into Australia since I don't know, the 90s, I think. Like it's been a while. It's like this guy just is not allowed, but it's because of his views. Um, but in, I guess, 15, 20 years ago, no one batted an eye, and they thought, it was fine because this person is a threat to society. But now, because these things are happening, people are awakening to the fact that it's not right. And so I feel like there's a moral, um, I guess, values based and morals based sentiment that's being carried through to go, like, we don't agree with what's going on. And so COVID definitely pushed that to people, saying, like, it's not fair, I'm locked down, it's not fair that I've been denied access to my family, it's not fair that I've been forced to take this jab in order to work, and all those sorts of stuff. So they're realizing now that none of it was voluntarily. It was coerced, and they were forced into a particular way of life or a decision that they had to make. My hope is that if we do continue to have governance the way that we have had, and my hope is that it lessens and it kind of dilutes to the point where we can be more self-governing. But at the very least, I hope society holds people accountable in these spaces. I just think what pisses me off about all of that is that I just think they get away with too much, and I don't think enough people voice their disapproval of when things aren't going right. So if I've put you in charge of running the economy and the economy's turned to shit, well, then you're not doing a good job. So in any other environment, you would be held accountable. If I sold you something from my business and you got sick and you took me to task on that, you'd probably win, and I'd probably suffer the consequences. Where we have situations like in the last couple of years where people have been sick and died, and they got all these injuries, and no one seems to be held accountable for anything that they do or say. Like, it just seems like they get let off the hook every single time. So nothing short of a revolution is probably needed, and I hope that it can be a peaceful one. But that's my hope. My hope is that people start to actually voice their opinions more and start getting comfortable with being a voice of reasoning and holding these people accountable when they do make mistakes, and correcting the course so we can get back to a more harmonious way of living. But as to how that's going to play out, is anyone's guess, I guess.
Yeah, and to me, there's something important in disengaging with the system. I don't know how it unfolds either, but it's sort of like, yeah, the system's doing its thing, but I'm a sovereign being, so part of me just doesn't care. And maybe as we become less and less attached to what the system is doing, that's part of its own dissolution. And then the creation of the alternative in parallel, where we're actually doing things in a truly free manner.
Yeah.
But we'll see how it shakes out.
Yeah. Look, I would like people to be, like, civil disobedience. I think is definitely something that is needed. And I think that if I'm getting into an argument with you, I can choose to engage or disengage. And if you're saying I should go left, I have that choice to say no, I'd rather go right. So I think that people can just not play the game. They can just not get involved in it. As to, again, there's sort of levels and layers of, to what degree do you be disagreeable, and does that cause more harm than good? But I think when it comes to, like, all the shit that's gone on the last couple of years, if more people just said, look, I think this is a bunch of bullshit, or I'm not going to not close my business, I would have loved to have had the balls to go, I'm just not closing my business. And if it ever happens again, I feel like, well, I hope that people will just not comply. I think that would be the end to this sort of tyrannical government that seems to be forcing its hand on everyone's way of life, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right that compliance is a big part of what enables the system to continue. And the compliance often comes from people just not being aware of the deception. Sometimes people comply just because, let's say, they need a paycheck and they say I have no choice, and that's their decision. But I think in many cases, people are complying because they think it's the right thing to do, because often they're being deceived. And I would put myself in this category, and I've been trying to uncover the deceptions that I was previously ignorant to.
Yeah.
So that's why like podcasts like yours are super important, because you just never know who's going to hear something and how it shifts them and shifts the other people around them. I find all of this to be very much a grassroots effort. because the system itself is never going to be broadcasting this sort of thing. It's going to have to come from individuals and communities.
Mm. Have you had anyone that's converted in a way? Like, has anyone ever come back to you and said, "I'm really sorry for the way I treated you through the pandemic," or I thought you were a conspiracy theorist, but now I think there's maybe some validity to what you're doing and saying.
No. I have had people maybe take a little bit of more of an interest,
Sure.
but I haven't heard any apologies or what you described. But I also don't hear from that many people for some reason, positive or negative. I don't get that much interaction.
Right. Uh, Probably one of the things that annoys me the most is society as a whole has a, and obviously I've been victim of this, and I try to catch myself out as much as possible. I think the go along to get along type of way of being is just like I may not feel like I agree with something, but because everyone else is doing it or saying it, I'm just going to sort of spew the same rhetoric from what they're saying, and I'm going to go along just to make sure that I don't get ostracized. And even like the government and people setting each other off has proven to I don't know if you've ever self-censored yourself, like we disagree with censorship, and we are all for free speech, but you still have this self-censoring part of your brain that says, oh, I better not say it, or I better word it in such a way that's like politically correct, or it doesn't incite, too much discord or too much pushback from my peers or from society and as a whole, particularly when it comes to social media, and you've got people that are happy to be keyboard warriors and throw their thoughts on the page, so to speak. So do you find that?
Yes, to all of that. I mean, I haven't figured out a solution to it really beyond trying to focus more on myself.
Yeah.
And like I can't control what other people are going to do. So what can I do to handle it better, the people around me, and then also just work on whatever demons I have within myself to just be a better person. And then that the stuff around me seems to affect me less as I evolve personally.
For sure. Yeah, when it comes to, I haven't read what was your latest book, the End to
The
Upside Down
cosmos.
Cosmos? That's right. Yeah, I haven't read it yet, but I did listen to your podcast with Here for the Truth. So that was really, really good. I don't know enough about both models to know to argue. So when I get into arguments about whether the Earth is flat or round, I do lean on the flat Earth theory, and it's a very basic sort of dumbed down way of thinking of it. And I just look at evidence to support that it's not a globe. So like water finding its level, the like the sun and the moon in the same sky on the same side, and all these sorts of things. I kind of looked to certain things, the horizon being always like flat, and to me seeing things with my naked eye. Like, have you ever looked at the moon and seen the detail of the moon, and you kind of think like, is it really 93 million miles away, or is it is it only like, I don't know, 15,000 kilometers away? I don't know. Like, it just, how can I see this with my naked eye? So all of those things kind of don't add up to the fact that the way that the world is depicted is the way it is. I was saying the other night, and again, like, I don't know the counter argument to all of this because I don't know enough about it, but I want to hear your thoughts on this because have you ever watched Ancient Apocalypse with Graham Hancock? Have you ever seen those that series?
I've watched a little bit of it and I'm familiar with his work.
Yeah, okay. So the interesting part about what he alludes to is an ancient civilization that were like so cluey on maths and astrology, and they sort of built these huge structures that are in alignment with the winter and summer solstice, and the sun hits a certain point at a certain time, and they'll kind of say things like the same stars that were in the sky at that time, that when this was built 13,000 years ago, are the same stars that are in the sky now. So you can see that it it automatically lines up to Orion's belt and all this kind of stuff, right? Anyway, I'm probably butchering a lot of the information, but my mind goes to, well, if the same constellation and stars and everything was that of that 13,000 years ago than it is today, doesn't that allude to the fact that the space is not spinning at the rate that it is, and the world and the globe is not spinning at the rate that it is, and everything's dancing around each other all the time? Am I silly in thinking that way, or am I sounding like a complete goose, or what?
I think you raise a lot of important points that got me interested. Just one point though, the moon, we're told, is 238,000 miles away, which is still really far. The sun is supposed to be 93 million miles away. And interestingly, during the eclipse, they just appear in the sky to be the exact same size, but it's not because they're the same size according to the mainstream model. It's just because the ratios of their distance and their sizes happens to be such that they look like they're exactly the same size, and one can eclipse the other. That's interesting. Or maybe they're not, maybe they are close to the same size and they're both much closer than we're told. That's a possibility. But even the framing of this whole debate, I think, could use just a recontextualization, because often there's a debate, is it flat or is it a sphere, a spinning globe, versus what I feel more comfortable. Is the spinning globe model correct, or can we falsify it? And then what the correct answer is, whether it's a flat framework or something else, something like it, we would have to do more research. But there are just many ways to basically poke holes in the current cosmology. And there's this principle that sometimes frustrates people where they say, well, if you can't tell me what the correct answer is, then I'm just going to go with the status quo.
Sure.
And the analogy I use in my book is, imagine you're taking a multiple choice test with a group of people and your teacher says, you've got to submit one answer. There are options A, B, C, and D on the test. And you go and research and you're like, look, I have falsified A. And everyone else in your group says, well, we think A is right. And then they look at your evidence and they say, actually, it's pretty good evidence that you've falsified A. And they say, well, is the answer then B, C, or D? It's got to be one of them. And you say, I don't know because I haven't done that research yet. And they say, well, if you don't know if it's B, C, or D, then we're going to go with A.
Got to be A.
It's got to be A. I mean, it's very irrational, but that's kind of the thinking that many people adhere to. So trying to get people out of that thinking, including myself, and to say, well, what are the holes in the current model? And also, let me make another point that I think it is currently impossible to create a comprehensive alternative model because we can't freely explore the things that we would need to in order to have a full model. So for example, if we wanted to prove a globe, one way to do that very easily would be to dig down all the way and end up on the other side of space, because we're supposed to be a ball, literally a sphere, floating in space and actually flying around in many different directions, free falling around the sun at over 60,000 miles an hour, while we're in an expanding universe moving at over 1,000,000 miles an hour, and at the equator, rotating faster than the speed of sound, and all sorts of things. But we should be able to, on that sphere, to prove the sphere, you could just dig all the way down. And the radius value of the sphere is supposed to be 4,000 miles, roughly. So these are all very specific things that we should be able to validate. And yet the furthest we've ever been able to dig down in any expedition is under 8 miles.
Wow.
Whoa. So how can we don't really know what's below us to be able to come up with a model? In terms of what's above us, we're relying on space agencies primarily. And now there's a little bit of private exploration. But if we wanted to prove, let's just say the sphere, the spinning globe, how would we do that? I'm just thinking, like, what would be very convincing to me? And I think we would need a lot of these, but it would be great to have video footage of the full sphere of Earth spinning, doing a full rotation where you can see every geographic location, and it's continuous footage. So not stopping and starting, because a lot of space footage is not continuous. You see a rocket going up and then they stop and they show you the image from above, but then you don't know, it's not continuous. So we'd want to have that continuous footage. We don't have that. We have many images from space agencies that are admittedly composites, meaning it's a compilation of multiple images, or CGI, meaning computer generated, or artist renditions. And the last image we're supposed to have had was from 1972 from the alleged moon landing.
Wow.
But even that doesn't show a sphere. It shows you a circular disk. There's a difference between a circle and a sphere. If we want a full sphere to see the ball versus just one side of what looks like a disk. But that image from 1972, the blue marble, has been all over iPhones. And the artist from NASA who created it said he photoshopped and actually had to use his own, basically, I quote him in the book. I can just paraphrase, but he had to alter it. So that wasn't even a pure image. So we got problems in terms of exploring below. We have problems in terms of exploring above, because also even like at the ISS level or a level of an airplane, we want to see not just what appears to be a little bit of curvature. We want to see the full sphere. And curvature is different than, let's say, spherical curvature is different than circular curvature. Very important thing, because some people will say, I got on an airplane, Mark, and I saw the curvature. Well, did you see down and away curvature? Because technically you should be at the top of the ball always, and that means it should be going down and away. And you're actually on a plane, you're not at a high enough altitude, according to the geometry of what the ball is, to see significant curvature, but you might see circular curvature where it looks like a circle, and that has to do with the way we perceive. It's called perspective, and this is a much more complicated discussion. It's called something called an azimuthal grid of vision, where things in the distance, we end up having a dome-shaped vision where it looks like we're in a dome just because of the way we see. So it looks curved, but it's not spherical, it's circular. So anyway, there are problems in terms of seeing from above, problems with exploring below, and then even problems with exploring within Earth, which we would need to do to have a full model, which is we want to explore both poles fully. And there are some restrictions in the North Pole and a lot of questions about what's actually there. But the South Pole and Antarctica is really the big one, because there's an Antarctic treaty signed in 1959, which restricts free and private access south of the 60th south latitude. And some people might rebut this and say, well, Mark, we've been to Antarctica. There are trips there. You can go. I mean, to me, that would be like saying, I know all about North America because I visited part of San Francisco.
Yeah.
It's kind of a ridiculous argument. We need to see all of Antarctica mapped out fully to know what's there.
Mhm.
So we end up in a place, to me, and I'm actually summarizing what many others have said too, is that we currently cannot create a comprehensive model, but Adrian, there are some observations that do seem to work better on a flat model than a spherical model. Doesn't mean the flat model is correct. Just the affirming the consequent fallacy is an important thing to remember. Just because an observation fits a model doesn't mean that model is true. So one example is people are able to see things that should be blocked by Earth's curvature. So it would be like if you're trying to see something around a bend, you couldn't because you're blocked by the bend. Like there's physical stuff getting in the way. You can't see. So if we're on a ball, there should be things you can't see because it's below the curve.
Yeah.
And yet people are repeatedly doing this where they go out, whether it's with binoculars or depending on the altitude, the height of what you're seeing. Sometimes you can do it with the naked eye, but over and over again, they're seeing things that should be blocked by curvature and they're running the numbers. And repeatedly, the mainstream advocates will say, this is a mirage that you're seeing because the light is somehow bending. It's called refraction, and you're not actually seeing it. You're seeing an illusion. But let's just say it's true that what people are seeing, they're able to see things that are too far. It still doesn't prove a flat model. And by the way, the word flat is a bit misleading because to call it a topographical plane is a bit more precise, meaning
Mhm.
it's a plane that it has peaks and valleys, because we know there are mountains and valleys and things like
I
that.
agree with
So
that.
this topographical plane model would accommodate certain observations of seeing things that are too far away. But some would say, Mark, it just could be a bigger sphere. Maybe it's just bigger than we've been told. That's true. The problem is if it is a bigger sphere, that means the radius is much different than we've been told. And that means the mass of Earth would then be different, which would mess up everything because gravity is based on gravity, quote unquote, and relativity, which we could get into a longer discussion about, is based on mass. And if the mass of Earth is different, then that means everything in cosmology has to be readjusted. Day-night cycles, so many different things would have to be readjusted if we had the wrong radius value. Those are just a few examples, and I mentioned many, many of them in the book. To me, it's this compilation of evidence where it's like, wait a second, why can't I prove the spinning globe? Shouldn't I be able to just prove it? Shouldn't there be a test that just definitively where this can only be explained by the spinning globe, and repeatedly it fails, and repeatedly it's like, no, that image is actually composite CGI. Actually, we don't have an image since the 1970s that hasn't been doctored at all. But we have this image from, like there was this Red Bull expedition, Felix Baumgartner went up in space and it looked like you could see curvature of Earth. Turns out they used a fisheye lens. So it made it look like there was curvature when there wasn't. So every time I look, like the ISS, people say, well, what's going on with the ISS? I don't know. I haven't been there myself, but there are many videos of people dropping things when it should be zero gravity. And you have one astronaut, and I quote a bunch of this stuff in my book, watching the videos, where there's an astronaut saying, look, there are these gravity pockets up in space. So he's got a hammer floating in one hand, and then
Yeah.
he drops a playing card and it falls straight down. And it's like, wait a second, the ISS is moving thousands of miles an hour. How would he know where the gravity pocket is?
Yeah.
And it's like very strange things, which to me, it just makes me question
It
the
does.
conventional cosmology.
I think the thing that's frustrating is the easy explainer ways that are like, when you mention the curvature, like if I'm looking out the ocean, I can see a ship that might be, I don't know, 5 or 6 kilometers away or 10 kilometers away. You'd like to think that perhaps the curvature would diminish the look of the what I can see, and like it'll abstract, whatever. But it's the same with buildings and things like that. And then when you question that, people might say, well, it's just because the Earth is so large, it looks flat, but it's actually a curve. But then when you think, well, okay, but I'm looking at something that's like 10 or 15 or 20 kilometers away, like it should have some sort of curve over that period, that plane, but it's not. It's actually looking really flat. And then other things are like when you talk to gravity and stuff like that, I think the human nature, when there's something that's unexplainable, it's almost like they inject another thing in there just so I can fill the gap between what I can prove and what's unexplainable. Am I making sense?
Yes.
So it's just like, oh, well, I pick up this phone, I drop it and it falls. There's a gravitational force that is pulling it towards the earth. And then they kind of just expand on that model, but it's largely just the theorized, like it's just theory. It's not terribly proven. And the fact that the apple falls from the tree, it doesn't mean that there's something pulling it down. Could it be that it just weighs just weighs more than just weighs more than air? Like, I don't know. It's a very simple way of looking at things, and I think when people just explain it, I have this debate with my kids because they go to school and they obviously say, if we didn't have gravity, the world would just implode on itself, and then it does all this stuff. I'm like, how do you prove that? I don't know how that can I don't know how that can be a proven theory when it's unless I'm unawares of any tests or anything like that that's kind of said gravity actually exists.
Yeah, great points. And you're raising an important distinction between an effect and a cause. So the fact that an apple falls to the ground doesn't tell us why the apple fell to the
Yeah.
ground. The explanation of gravity is that mass is attracting mass, meaning there's something inherent in matter that attracts other matter to it if there's more matter. So the earth has more matter than the apple, so the apple falls down to it. That's the belief. And I'll give a little explanation, a summary of what I talk about in my book, and maybe your kids will find this interesting. Um, so the theory of gravity, Newton's theory of gravity, which is that the apple falls down to the ground because the mass of Earth is greater than the mass of the apple. Newton's gravity is an incomplete theory because it's unable to predict very important things like Mercury's motion around the sun. Newton's gravity cannot predict this. So we got a big problem because if you need a comprehensive model of motion, for example, you should be able to predict Mercury's motion. Sorry, that's a problem. So Newton's law is not, I mean, we can call them laws, but they're really incomplete. It's sort of like the excuse is, well, that's just a little anomaly. Don't worry, Mark. I like to give this example of if there's a law that says that all swans are white, and you go around the world and you literally find a million white swans, and then one day you find a black swan. Well, the law said all swans are white, and you found a black swan. So there, all means all, doesn't mean most. So okay, we got a problem with gravity on its face, and then Einstein basically revised gravity with his general relativity theory. And under Einstein's theory, it's not that mass is attracting mass; it just sort of looks that way. But mass is bending space-time, so you end up with these things attracting each other based on their masses.
Mm-hmm.
Problem is that Einstein's relativity, and I go through this in more detail in the book, there are many holes and flaws with it. The one that stands out most to me is actually how I start my book, which is that in 1933, there was an astronomer, Fritz Zwicky, who saw a cluster of galaxies, the Coma cluster, and he was observing their motion, basically, and they were moving at a rate that would not have been predicted under Einstein's gravity because there wasn't enough mass there. There was under 1% of the mass that there should have been in order for his observations to work. And what he could have said, and this is to your point, Adrian, what scientists could have said is, okay, we need to rethink all of gravity and Einstein's relativity because something's not working.
Mm.
Instead, they said, we just discovered dark matter. There's something there that we don't know what it is, and we're going to plug it in because that makes our theory work. And that's not exactly what they say.
I know what you mean.
You know what I mean? I'm putting in a new narrative because that's effectively what they did. The problem is that according to mainstream physicists, including astrophysicists, excuse me, including Pavel Krupa from the University of Bonn in Germany, he's now saying in the last few years very openly that he and his colleagues have spent about 25 years looking at this. and the predictions that you'd expect under dark matter don't work. So in other words, he says dark matter doesn't exist. We have falsified dark matter. So you end up
Wow.
with this house of cards, and he says they've done it with 5 sigma results, more than 5 sigma, meaning 99.99999% certainty that there's no dark matter. So if there's no dark matter, then we got big problems with gravity and relativity. And then we have to start from scratch and say, okay, we know motion exists because we see motion, we see things falling down. How could we explain it? I don't have an exact answer, but before I close, I'll just give the explanation that I hear many giving, including Stephen A. Young, who wrote A Fool's Wisdom, the theoretical physics PhD, that density and buoyancy are one way, that a denser object falls because it's denser than the air around it. So the apple's denser than the air around it, falls down. Helium gas is less dense than the air around it, so it rises. Then the question becomes, why does a denser thing fall down? Why is there this downward bias? And what many people are pointing to is what they call a downward electric current that is inherent on Earth. And so they talk about an electrostatic force. Actually, Richard Feynman talked about this in one of his lectures. He's a famous Caltech physicist. I quote him in my book. And this might explain many anomalies out there, like the fact that things fall at different rates during thunderstorms, and also something called the Hutchinson effect, using apparently electrical something like it to levitate heavy objects. And there are weird anomalies where you might look to more traditional electrostatics to try to explain motion rather than invoking this mysterious gravity that has many flaws in it.
Yeah. It just raises more and more questions. Like that's the thing. It never gives any solution or any finite solution to it. And again, like you said that so well, because they, with the dark matter example, it can't be that gravity is the model that we've built around gravity is broken. So therefore we should look at that. We add something into it to keep this firmly in place. And then we add another complexity to it, which just makes the world even more bizarre than what it was before. And then we're like, oh, we've just discovered this new thing. And now all of a sudden it's a distraction. It takes away from where you should have been looking, and not to, and not filling in the void of something else, for want of a better word. Viruses are the same, like rather than go down, can we prove that it's been isolated? We just say, there's something that is causing a particular inflammation, and it has to be this. So, we're going to run with that. It's like, it's nothing else. And anyway, it's super frustrating.
Yeah, because what's happens is we get locked into a model, and that's where all the academic focus is, and that's where all the funding is. So the alternatives aren't explored as much. And then people will rebut and say, hey, Mark and Adrian, you don't have enough evidence that these other alternatives are true. Show me all the peer-reviewed papers. And we can say, well, of course not, because who's actually funding the studies? And you need to be a very brave scientist to leave the mainstream to be able to study the stuff. And sometimes you could lose your career or not get tenure. I've heard this repeatedly in various areas. So it ends up becoming self-fulfilling, where, yeah, there isn't as much evidence for an alternative, but we don't claim to have an alternative yet, because all we can tell you is that the mainstream model isn't correct. And even Pavel Krupa, the astrophysicist I mentioned, he was asked in an interview, he's like, okay, well, you just said that dark matter is falsified. Why is this such a big focus in academia? And what Pavel Krupa said is that this is where all the prizes are awarded. This is where all the funding is. So ultimately, and if you're new in your career as a physicist, you want to be studying dark matter, because dark matter is supposed to be about 25% of the universe. And if you add dark energy, the two combined are like 96% of the universe.
Wow.
This plug. So only 4% of the universe we understand. And so this is the hot area in physics. And he goes, look, it's just sociological pressures that are pushing people, whereas we've clearly falsified this.
Do you find it bizarre that you can have an entire career being funded on research into something that's not there? Like, do you know what I mean? It's just like, it sounds so fucking bizarre that I can be awarded large sums of money to fund a study and a research that could take my entire lifetime to figure out that it doesn't exist.
It's hard for a lot of people to accept that, especially if they've spent their whole careers. I mean, talk about viruses. The field of virology is based on a particle that arguably has not been established using the scientific method. I mean, paraphrasing Mark Bailey, who's a doctor in New Zealand, he says something like virology basically was invented before the particle that it's supposed to represent has been established. And think about how crazy that is. So you
Yeah,
end up with all these logical fallacies where it's like, well, I did a PCR test and then I know that that matches the viral genome. The problem is, well, how do you know it's a viral genome if you haven't isolated the virus in a purified sample by itself? Because you would need to have just the virus first in order to know what its genome is. So you might be detecting something, but you don't know it's viral just
yeah,
by the genomics. So you end up with all these problems where people are just assuming something to be true without the foundations having been examined, and you end up with multi-billion-dollar industries based on a certain model. I mean, space exploration is a very similar thing. The model is based on the spinning globe cosmology and a Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago, and gravity being a certain way, and a vacuum of space. Whereas we can demonstrably show in many ways that basic elements of physics don't seem to align with their narrative. I mean, I'll give you one other example that Stephen Young, the theoretical physics PhD, mentions, and many others do too, is that basic pressure physics doesn't seem to work with the spinning globe, or basically an open pressure system that we're alleged to have, meaning that there's a vacuum of space under the current cosmology, meaning it's extremely low pressure. That's what vacuum means. Next to Earth, which has an atmosphere of gas. And this vacuum of space is sitting peacefully next to our atmosphere.
yeah,
Why is that problematic? Because imagine if you open up a can of soda, you end up with high pressure inside the can because you have uh, that because there's gases in there. You open it up and there's a loud noise because the air around the soda can is lower pressure than the gases inside. And when you open up the can, the gas reaches an equilibrium basically by diffusing out into the lower pressure area. And you'd
yep.
think that if we had this almost infinite vacuum of space of such low pressure, how could it be that the gases of Earth just sit next to it? There's this massive gradient, a massive differential of pressure, and yet
Mm,
they exist peacefully. What the argument is that's impossible. And the mainstream argument is, well, gravity should be holding in our gases. Gravity, which is supposed to be super weak sometimes, but then it's super strong.
other
It's
times, yeah,
able to withstand this pressure gradient of an infinite vacuum. Some people are not buying this, including Steve Young. So
yeah,
the argument is, well, maybe we live in some kind of enclosure.
yeah. I
And
was just about
who
to
knows
say
if
it's leading to the firmament being a more solid structure than just two types of gas or space or whatever it is. Yeah,
something that separates us, and the Bible talks about waters above and waters below. So it might not even be a vacuum of space, that
right.
maybe there's a fluid-like medium that the lights in the sky are moving within. And Crow 777 Radio produced a documentary where the host was using his telescope to look at the moon and other celestial bodies, and it almost looks like there's a fluid medium. He calls them lunar waves, where it looks like a fluid
Mm,
wave that you can
yep.
see. This is not definitive proof, but the point is, maybe what we're told about what's above us is not. It's not this infinite vacuum that we're told about in the movies and otherwise. And yet the space agencies build their entire narrative around this
Around it.
model, which doesn't even seem to align with a lot of our basic physics.
Mm. Yeah, man, we could go on and on and on. It's the same when you think about the sun and the moon and the theory behind it just being sort of like a not a solid object, just more of a plasma, type of energy field and frequency and things like that. So yeah, I've got to in my own mind, I'd like to think that when it comes to the Earth's plane and things like that. Um, it would be more of a like when you go beyond the ice wall, it's a longer plane, if that makes sense. Like it
Mhm.
just keeps going to other realms and other the much the same as I could travel from Australia to the US. If you go beyond the ice wall, I feel like there'd be further lands and other destinations and perhaps even other civilizations when we talk about other civilizations that may come into this world. I think there's in my mind, I've got a thought process that leads to there are other civilizations that live on the same plane. They're just like beyond the enclosures of the ice wall. Like there's no outer space traveling through time and all those sorts of things. I really feel like they're just coming from another place on the same Earth. That's how I feel anyway.
I think it's possible. And this is why it would be great to have free exploration of Antarctica to see if it's really just a continent floating in the ocean, like we're told,
Mm,
like an island. That's what the globe model says. Or is
yeah.
it something else, like basically an ice wall that it's a circle that encloses the circular lake of Earth? That's an alternative theory that's very popular. And who knows? There could be other lands out there. We don't know what's beyond. We haven't been able to explore it freely and privately. There could be massive amounts of land. And you're reminding me of the work that I would love to look into it more. Mike Wilkerson's work. He has
Mm.
a YouTube channel called Stellium 7. He was on Here
Yep.
for the Truth, but he's been looking at geological uh, things like mountains. And he started off on his channel looking at a mountain in Spain that looks like an elephant, a giant elephant. And
Mhm.
he started doing his own research by going through the caves of the mountain and correlating it with anatomy. And he's done this with hearts too, like looking at rocks that he thinks could be petrified hearts and many other things. The point is that, and the Bible talks about Nephilim, like we have to be open to these things now, because if Earth is maybe just a little circle within a massive plane or a much bigger one than we realize, then if you had giants that were walking across Earth, they could have a few steps relatively to cross our part of the plane when there's a much bigger area too, which then raises questions about other civilizations and
Sure.
history. And so like it's all the unknowns start to grow as we depart from the mainstream cosmology.
Yeah, it points to almost there being more truth in mythology than myth.
Yeah.
It's when you think about it, and I think if it in my mind, like when you look at something in a movie, for example, I always say like if it can be thought about it and created and depicted in a movie, then I feel like 9 times out of 10 it has happened. Like, and otherwise, like how would you make it up? I just feel like there's a if you go back to consciousness being all a continuum of energy that permeates through everyone and everything, then there's no such thing as a there's nothing new under the sun. Like everything that we are living in this cycle of time has been lived in the past, and to what variation or degree that is, like whether it be at different species or whether it be giants or whether it be, like it could be anything. But I agree. We need to be open to the possibilities that there is much more to the world, our civilizations, our history that has, like Graham Hancock says, we've got a what did he say? Like a amnesia. We've got a species with amnesia. We seem to have these gaps in the timeline which affect a lot. Like you can't just miss thousands of years of information and then start again, and all of a sudden we've got a pyramid that is mind-boggling to think how it was constructed, and then we go to horse and cart after that. Like
Yeah.
none of that computes and makes sense in my mind.
Yeah, these common sense things you're raising, Adrian, we're always told, it seems, to just ignore common sense because an
Yeah.
expert told us these things. Like certainly it feels to us like we live on a stationary place that's not moving. And yet we're told by the scientists that we are, like I said before, rotating on a tilted axis at faster than the speed of sound at the equator, but around the poles on the globe, almost not moving at all, while free falling around the sun at over 60,000 miles an hour, while having multiple different wobbles on an axis, while revolving around the Milky Way galaxy at over 500,000 miles an hour and moving in an expanding universe at over 1 million miles an hour. And it's obviously perfectly constant, because if it weren't constant, we would feel it. And it's just such big speeds that we're not feeling anything. So don't worry, you're actually not moving. And surgeons who are performing precise surgeries, they're not worrying about any little bump in our motion, any non-uniformity in our motion. And people who build these statues of rocks where any little movement, like an earthquake, would probably make it fall, no one's worrying about any alterations in our movement because everything's perfectly constant. It's extremely counterintuitive. And I mean, what I think is that basically the physics has had to come up with such counterintuitive assumptions in order to maintain their model, which is that
Mhm.
Earth does not occupy a special place in the cosmos. It's known as the Copernican principle. We don't occupy a special place. So then you have to come up with all sorts of explanations to create an alternative model, which end up sounding pretty ridiculous when you just ask yourself. Because if we didn't have scientists telling us these things, what would we say? We wouldn't have any reason to believe we live on a sphere. Okay. We wouldn't have any reason to believe we live on something that's moving. We see things in the sky moving around us in predictable patterns. And that's what it looks like. That doesn't mean it's true, but it is interesting that so many times we're told to just believe things that someone says, trust us. Same thing with the virus. No one's ever seen this virus particle go from one person to another and infect a cell and do all the replication, all the steps that we're told. But we have a movie that's been created because the scientists know what's best and they have their fancy microscopes, and we're just supposed
Yeah.
to trust their methodologies. So those are just a few examples, but we could apply that everywhere. We're told to
Everywhere.
trust and it's not always so clear cut when you look at their assumptions.
So in wrapping this up, like when you think about all of these sort of explorations that we've been discussing and you apply it to how you practically live, is there, now that you know what you know, how do you derive, I mean, I know how you derive meaning and purpose because it's coming through your literature and work and things that you're doing, but how do you then, can you articulate it in a way as to how you practically apply it to your way of life or the way that you view the world? Because I feel like people, this is where people come unstuck, because like you said before, well, if that's wrong, what else is wrong? And then it can cause you to feel discomfort in the fact of like, what the fuck am I doing? If all of this is wrong, what's the point of doing what I'm doing? Like, none of it makes sense. What's my existence? Why am I here? So do you have a way of articulating how you think about that particular question?
Hmm. Well, I wrote a book called An End to Upside Down Living, but I wrote that in 2020, and it has a picture of a globe on it. Even though I wasn't trying to make a point about the globe model, it just happened to be like the icon that we chose for the cover. But my point is that I do think about this a lot. And my answer is kind of evolving. In some ways, it's not evolving, and in some other ways, it is.
Mm-hmm.
What's not evolving is that I think we are here ultimately to be of service and to evolve. So it's like we try to grow as individuals to become the best version of ourselves so that we can be of service because there's some kind of interconnectivity here. And that can be manifested in so many different ways. And I think that framework is applicable to many people's purposes that they could come up with about what we're doing here and how to live practically. But maybe a way I think about it now, which I think it does relate to this too, is that trying to uncover truths through the process of dismantling falsehood. So narrowing down the possibilities of what's true by finding out what's false seems to be a very important thing, because once we stop living in alignment with falsehoods, there's something that we can, maybe we're better able to be of service and better able to do whatever we're here to do because we're living more in truth. So I think that's really critical, as I've learned about more and more deception, is uncovering the falsehoods and then living with integrity in accordance with that. And that can be challenging sometimes, because let's say we uncover a falsehood, and let's just say the jab is a good example. We do our homework on it and realize, whoa, we're not being told the truth. But then we are pushed. It's like, do we leave our job if the job requires it? Or are we just going to go along with it? So it's like, those are the kinds of tests I think we're faced with, of how much in integrity can we be living.
Mm. I think that's well said. I really think, and I've said this heaps over the last 4 years, is it does take courage to live in integrity. It takes courage to be individual and embrace your individuality. And I think that it really does come from a place of first inner knowing and then decisively acting congruently towards those belief systems and those value systems. At the same time, Mark, like, you've got to be open to the fact that your mind can be changed. I don't think you can be that dogmatic and fixed in a particular mindset. I think things can be, if they're allowed to be opened to new ways of being, thinking, and doing. And I think that that's certainly something that you need to be open-minded towards. But living congruently is a tough act. Like you said, if you don't believe in the jab and you don't feel like it's the right thing to be forced, are you willing to then act on that and change your career or move from where you live and uproot your family and go somewhere else? If you feel like our food is toxic and the big supermarket chains are just selling a bunch of rubbish, are you going to alter your day in order to go to this particular meat source or fruit source or fruit and veg and all the rest of it and add that to your day because we've been so conditioned to living a certain way? Are these people that are in your lives, are they adding to it or are they taking it away? And do you have the courage to distance yourself or maybe remove those people from your life so you have more harmony and more peace and love, and are you willing to look inside yourself and, like you said a minute ago, like looking towards the demons and uncover those things and explore parts of yourself that are kind of ugly and vulnerable and frightening, and work through that to the degree that you can be the best version of yourself. That's a pretty courageous act.
Yes, I think that's a challenge we're all being faced with right now.
So true. Okay, mate, it's been such a great time talking to you. I really love these kinds of conversations. If people want to go and read all your books and explore your work and things like that, where's the best place to find you?
My website, it's markgober.com, markgober.com. I have 7 books out, and they are available on Amazon in hard copy, Kindle, and Audible formats. I read the Audible myself, and I have a podcast series. It's only 8 episodes from 2019, but it's still relevant because it's talking about consciousness and the brain, life after death, the nature of reality. It's called Where Is My Mind? And it's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and other major players.
Nice. Mate, you're an absolute machine when it comes to writing books. I can't believe how many books you're putting out. I'm so jealous. I haven't done one, and I've got a goal to put one out. So I'm going to have to pull my finger out and do something about that. But you should definitely start another podcast. I'm not trying to tell you what to do, but your podcast was great, and I was saddened to have it end at only 8 episodes. But I think, with your connections and the work that you've done, if you started a podcast, I would follow in an instant. It would be it'd be a really good thing.
Thank you. You are not the first person to say that. Especially recently, a lot of people have been asking me to do another one.
Yeah,
so we'll see.
All right, man. Well, until we meet again, have an amazing day, and I appreciate you, bro. I really do. I think that your work is fantastic, and I want to encourage everyone to go along and have a read of your books and listen to your interviews and things like that. So thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon.
Awesome. Thanks for all you do too, Adrian.
Thank you,
Fun
bro.
talking.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
mate.